The day Deputy Director Mason Reed walked across the main hall of FBI headquarters and stopped directly in front of me, my father forgot how to speak. For a few seconds, he simply stared, holding his invitation in one hand as if it had suddenly become useless. Around us, senior agents, federal officials, decorated officers, and invited guests continued moving through the building. But for my father, the entire world seemed to freeze. He had spent most of my life believing he understood exactly who I was. In that moment, he realized he didn't know me at all. But stories like this never begin in Washington, D.C. They never begin beneath bright lights or inside buildings where history is made. They begin in ordinary places where nobody is paying attention. They begin inside homes where one child slowly learns that being loved and being seen are not always the same thing. My name is Rachel Bennett. I am 39 years old, and for most of my childhood I felt invisible inside my own family. I grew up outside Billings, Montana, in a small town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. My father, Daniel Bennett, was respected by nearly everyone who met him. He worked hard, showed up when people needed help, paid his bills, volunteered at church events, and carried himself like a man who took responsibility seriously. If you had asked our neighbors whether he was a good father, they would have answered yes without hesitation. The strange thing is that they wouldn't have been entirely wrong. My father never yelled at me. He never hit me. He never abandoned us. He simply reserved most of his attention for someone else. My younger brother Ethan was 6 years younger than me, and from the moment he was born, it felt as though the center of gravity inside our house shifted permanently in his direction. Ethan was outgoing, athletic, funny, and naturally confident. People loved being around him. Teachers remembered him. Coaches praised him. Relatives talked about him constantly. My father adored him. Even as a little girl, I could see the difference. Children notice those things long before adults think they do. We notice who gets celebrated. We notice who gets forgiven. We notice whose stories get repeated at family dinners and whose accomplishments are forgotten before dessert arrives. One afternoon when I was 9 years old, I came home carrying a certificate from a statewide academic competition. I had spent weeks preparing for it. I still remember sitting at the kitchen table every night practicing while other kids watched television. When they announced my name at school, I felt proud in a way I had never felt before. The bus ride home seemed to last forever because I couldn't wait to show my father. I ran through the front door and found him sitting in the kitchen reading the newspaper. "Dad, look what I got," I said, holding out the certificate. He glanced at it, smiled politely, and nodded. "Good job, Rachel." For a brief moment my heart lifted. Then Ethan walked into the room carrying a toy baseball bat and everything changed. My father immediately turned toward him. "Show me that swing, buddy." Within seconds, the certificate was forgotten. I stood there holding the paper while my father laughed and clapped for a 6-year-old pretending to hit a baseball. At the time, I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Years later, I realized that moment wasn't important because it was unique. It was important because it happened over and over again. The wall in our living room told the story better than words ever could. Ethan's trophies covered shelf after shelf. Team photographs filled frame after frame. Newspaper clippings, championship plaques, medals, ribbons, certificates, all carefully displayed where visitors could admire them. Every year, the collection grew larger. Whenever family members came over, my father proudly walked them through Ethan's accomplishments. He could remember every score, every tournament, every coach, every award. Meanwhile, I earned straight A's, won academic competitions, served on student leadership committees, and volunteered throughout the community. None of it ever found its way onto that wall. For years I wondered what it felt like to walk into a room and know someone was proud of you before you even spoke. The only person who seemed to understand what I was feeling was my grandfather, Thomas. Grandpa lived alone in a small blue house outside town and somehow always knew when something was wrong. Unlike most adults, he listened more than he talked. One evening after a family gathering that revolved entirely around Ethan's latest baseball tournament, I slipped outside and sat alone on the back porch. The sun was setting behind the mountains, and I remember staring at the horizon, trying to understand why being ignored hurt so much. A few minutes later, Grandpa walked outside, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. He sat beside me without saying anything. We remained silent for several minutes before he finally spoke. "You're hurting." I immediately looked away. "No, I'm not." He smiled gently. "Rachel, I've known you since the day you were born. You're hurting." Something about the way he said it made it impossible to keep pretending. I told him everything. I told him how invisible I felt. I told him how hard I worked. I told him how unfair it seemed that Ethan received attention simply for existing while I felt like I had to earn every scrap of approval. Grandpa listened carefully. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked toward the mountains. Being overlooked and being ordinary are not the same thing, he said quietly. I frowned. What does that mean? He smiled. It means some people are so focused on what they expect to see that they miss what's right in front of them. Those words stayed with me throughout high school. While Ethan became the star athlete everyone expected him to become, I focused on building a future for myself. I studied harder than anyone I knew. I joined leadership programs. I volunteered. I worked part-time jobs. I applied for every scholarship opportunity I could find. Somewhere along the way, I stopped trying to compete for attention and started trying to build independence. At the time, it felt lonely. Looking back now, it was one of the most valuable lessons I ever learned. The less support I received, the more resourceful I became. The less recognition I received, the more discipline I developed. While Ethan learned how to perform under applause, I learned how to keep going without it. During my junior year, something happened that changed the way I saw my father forever. One evening, I was walking through the garage when I overheard him talking with a friend. They didn't know I was nearby. The conversation centered almost entirely on Ethan. His athletic future, his college opportunities, his talent, his potential. Then the friend asked a simple question. How's Rachel doing? There was a brief pause. My father's answer came quickly. She's fine. That was it. Not brilliant. Not hardworking. Not ambitious. Not determined. Just fine. Then the conversation immediately returned to Ethan. I stood there frozen. For years I had hoped my father simply hadn't noticed my accomplishments. In that moment, I realized something much harder to accept. He noticed them. He just didn't value them the same way. That night I drove straight to Grandpa's house. He opened the door, took one look at my face, and invited me inside. We sat at his kitchen table while an old clock ticked softly on the wall. After listening to everything that had happened, he disappeared into another room. A few minutes later, he returned holding an old silver pocket watch. The metal was worn from decades of use. The chain had faded with age. He placed it gently on the table between us. My father gave this to me when I was your age, he said. I stared at the watch. Why are you showing me this? He pushed it toward me. Because now it's yours. I immediately shook my head. No, I can't take that. Yes, you can. His voice was calm but firm. I looked down at the watch again. Why? For a long moment he simply studied me. Then he smiled. Because one day you're going to need a reminder. A reminder of what? His eyes softened. A reminder that your value doesn't depend on who sees it. I wrapped my fingers around the watch and felt something tighten in my chest. At the time, I thought it was simply a meaningful gift. I didn't realize it would become one of the most important possessions I would ever own. I also didn't realize that only a few months later, the one person who had always believed in me would begin slipping away. One evening near the end of summer, I found Grandpa sitting alone on his porch watching the sunset. He looked older than I remembered, tired somehow. For a long time we sat together in silence. Then he asked a question that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Rachel, if everyone stopped believing in you tomorrow, what would you do? I laughed softly. I don't know. He nodded slowly. Then you'd better learn before they get the chance. Something about the way he said it filled me with unease. I turned toward him. Grandpa, why are you saying that? He stared toward the horizon where the last light was fading behind the mountains. Then he smiled sadly and said, Because one day you're going to discover that the people who underestimated you never really knew you at all. The question my grandfather asked that evening stayed with me long after I drove home. At the time, I didn't fully understand why it unsettled me so much. Maybe it was the way he said it. Maybe it was the long silence that followed. Or maybe some part of me already sensed what everyone else was trying desperately not to say out loud. For years, Grandpa Thomas had been the strongest person in my life. Not physically strong, although he had spent decades working long hours in Montana winters without complaint. He was the kind of strong that made other people feel safe, the kind that never seemed rushed, never seemed shaken, never seemed uncertain. Yet as we sat on that porch watching the sunset disappear behind the mountains, I noticed something I had never seen before. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix. The kind that settles deep inside a person. The kind that changes the way they move, the way they smile, the way they look at the future. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. I wanted to believe I was imagining it. But over the following weeks, pretending became impossible. School started again, and on the surface, life continued as normal. Ethan's senior football season dominated most conversations in our house. Recruiters visited games. Coaches called constantly. My father spent hours discussing possibilities, scholarships, training programs, and future opportunities. Every dinner seemed to revolve around Ethan's future. Every weekend revolved around Ethan's schedule. Meanwhile, I was quietly preparing college applications, applying for scholarships, and trying to balance school with my part-time job at a diner outside town. The strange thing was that by then, I had mostly stopped expecting recognition. Disappointment loses some of its power when it becomes familiar. What hurt wasn't my father's lack of attention anymore. What hurt was watching the one person who truly believed in me slowly fade. The first major change came in October. Grandpa stopped taking his daily walks. For as long as I could remember, he walked the same route every morning. Rain, snow, heat, wind. It didn't matter. He always went. One afternoon I arrived at his house and noticed his walking shoes sitting untouched by the door. He was resting in his chair by the window. "No walk today?" I asked. He smiled. "Just taking a break." It sounded harmless enough, but something about it felt wrong. A few days later, he canceled lunch with an old friend. Then he stopped attending church regularly. Then came more doctor appointments. Longer appointments. Appointments that left my mother looking worried afterward. Nobody explained much. Nobody thought they needed to. But fear has a way of filling in the blanks. One evening, I came home from work and found my parents sitting quietly at the kitchen table. Ethan was at practice. The television was off. The house felt unusually still. My mother looked up as I entered. Her eyes immediately softened in a way that made my stomach tighten. "How's Grandpa?" I asked. There was a pause. My father looked down at his coffee. My mother forced a smile. "He's having some tests done." Even then I knew it wasn't the whole truth. Adults often underestimate how much children understand. I wasn't a child anymore. I could see the worry in her face. I could hear it in her voice. The conversation ended there, but my mind refused to let it go. Over the next few weeks, I spent as much time with Grandpa as possible. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. One afternoon we sat on his porch for nearly an hour, watching clouds move across the sky without speaking more than a few sentences. Looking back, I think both of us understood that those quiet moments mattered. Not every important conversation happens through words. Sometimes simply being present becomes its own language. One Saturday afternoon, I helped him sort through old boxes in his garage. The space smelled like sawdust, motor oil, and decades of memories. We found photographs I had never seen before. Pictures of my mother as a child. Pictures of Grandpa when he was young. Pictures of family members who had passed away years earlier. At one point, I found an old photograph of him standing beside a mail truck, smiling proudly at the camera. He looked almost unrecognizable. Strong shoulders. Dark hair. Confident eyes. "You look happy," I said. He laughed softly. I was. Then his expression grew thoughtful. "Life goes faster than people realize, Rachel." I looked at the photograph again. "Do you regret anything?" For several seconds he didn't answer. Then he shook his head. "Very little." I smiled. "That's good." He nodded slowly. The secret is figuring out what matters before it's too late. Something about the way he said it stayed with me. By November, the truth could no longer be hidden. My mother finally sat me down one evening after dinner. I remember every detail of that conversation. The kitchen light above the table, the sound of wind outside the windows, the way she folded her hands before speaking. "Rachel," she said gently, "your grandfather is very sick." I stared at her. Part of me had known it for weeks. Hearing the words still felt like being punched in the chest. "How sick?" My mother looked away briefly before answering. "The doctors don't think he's going to get better." For a moment, everything went silent. The room, the house, the world. I remember nodding because I couldn't trust myself to speak. Then I stood up and walked outside. That night I sat alone on the back porch for nearly 2 hours. The temperature had dropped below freezing, but I barely noticed. My thoughts kept returning to the same question. What would life look like without him? The answer terrified me. For most of my life, Grandpa had been the person who reminded me who I was whenever I started forgetting. He was the voice that cut through doubt. The person who saw value in me even when I couldn't see it myself. Losing him felt impossible. The following afternoon I drove straight to his house after school. He was sitting in his favorite chair beside the window. When he saw me, he smiled immediately. For a while we talked about ordinary things. School, weather, football, anything except the truth sitting between us. Finally, I couldn't avoid it anymore, Mom told me. His smile faded slightly. He nodded. I figured she would. I looked down at my hands. Are you scared? The question surprised both of us. He thought for a moment before answering. A little. It was the first time I had ever heard him admit fear. Then he smiled again. But not for the reasons you think. I looked up. What do you mean? He leaned back in his chair. I've had a good life, Rachel. My concern isn't leaving. My concern is making sure the people I love know what matters before I do. Tears immediately filled my eyes. I hated crying, especially in front of him. But I couldn't stop them. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he reached into his pocket and placed his hand over the silver watch he had given me. Do you still carry it? I nodded. Every day. His smile widened slightly. Good, he pointed toward me, because one day that watch is going to remind you of something important. I wiped my eyes. What? His expression grew serious. That your life belongs to you. I frowned. Of course it does. He shook his head. No. Most people spend their lives letting other people decide who they are. Parents, teachers, bosses, strangers. Don't do that. His voice remained calm, but there was an urgency beneath it that I had never heard before. Your father doesn't see everything yet. That's his limitation, not yours. The words hit me harder than I expected, because deep down, part of me still wanted my father's approval. Part of me still hoped one day he would look at me the way he looked at Ethan. The sun was setting by the time I finally left. Before I reached the door, Grandpa called my name. I turned around. He looked at me quietly for several seconds. Then he smiled. One day they'll see who you really are. The sentence sounded strangely familiar, almost like a promise. I smiled back, trying to ignore the fear rising inside me. At the time, I thought he was talking about my father. Years later, I would realize he meant something much bigger. But before any of that could happen, before college, before the FBI, before Washington, before everything that would eventually change my life, I was about to face the hardest loss I had ever known. The last words my grandfather spoke to me stayed in my head long after I left his house that evening. One day they'll see who you really are. At the time, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe there would come a moment when everything made sense, when the years of feeling invisible would finally mean something. But hope is difficult when you're 17 years old and watching the strongest person in your life slowly disappear. Less than 3 weeks later, I received the phone call I had been dreading. I was sitting in my government class when the office secretary appeared at the door and asked me to gather my things. The moment I saw my mother's face waiting outside the school, I knew. Nobody needed to explain it. The drive to the hospital felt like a blur. I remember the road. I remember the gray sky hanging over the mountains. I remember my mother holding the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. What I don't remember is a single word either of us said. When we arrived, the room was quiet. Too quiet. Grandpa looked peaceful. For a moment, he almost appeared asleep. Then reality hit me. The person who had believed in me more than anyone else was gone. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Grief is a strange thing. Most people imagine it as overwhelming sadness, but often it feels more like emptiness. The world keeps moving while part of you remains frozen. School continued. Football games continued. Homework continued. Life continued. I remember sitting in class staring at teachers while barely hearing anything they said. I remember walking through hallways filled with students laughing and talking about ordinary things and wondering how they could possibly act normal when my world had just changed forever. At home, my mother mourned quietly. My father buried himself in work and Ethan's sports schedule. Everyone handled the loss differently. I handled it by working. Every spare moment became an opportunity to stay busy because staying busy meant thinking less. A few days after the funeral, my mother handed me a small envelope. "Your grandfather wanted you to have this," she said. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten note folded neatly in half. The handwriting was unmistakably his. I sat on my bed and read it over and over. The message wasn't long. In fact, it contained only a few sentences. But one sentence changed the course of my life. Never let someone else's opinion become your identity. I must have read those words 20 times that night. Then 30. Then 50. Eventually, I folded the note and placed it inside the same small case where I kept the silver pocket watch. From that day forward, I carried both everywhere. The months after Grandpa's death forced me to grow up faster than I expected. College suddenly became more important. Not because I was chasing prestige, but because I needed direction. I needed a future that belonged to me. My father remained focused on Ethan. Recruiters continued calling. Scholarship discussions dominated dinner conversations. Nobody asked much about my plans. At first, that bothered me. Then something unexpected happened. I stopped waiting. For years I had measured my progress against the attention Ethan received. Now I started measuring it against my own goals. It was a subtle shift, but it changed everything. Instead of wondering whether my father approved, I focused on what I wanted. Senior year ended with Ethan receiving multiple athletic scholarship offers. The entire family celebrated. There was a party. Relatives traveled from neighboring towns. My father spent the evening proudly telling everyone about Ethan's future. A week later, I received notice that I had earned a combination of academic scholarships and grants that would allow me to attend college with very little debt. Nobody organized a celebration. Nobody invited relatives. Nobody bought a cake. The strange thing was that for the first time, it didn't hurt. I simply smiled, accepted the offer, and started preparing for the next chapter of my life. College felt like stepping into an entirely different world. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who didn't know Ethan. They didn't know my father. They didn't know the role I had spent years playing inside my family. They only knew the version of me standing in front of them. I worked harder than ever. During the day, I attended classes. At night, I worked part-time jobs. Weekends disappeared beneath study sessions, volunteer programs, and leadership opportunities. It wasn't glamorous. Most of my classmates spent their free time socializing while I spent mine trying to survive financially. But something important was happening beneath the surface. Confidence was beginning to grow. Not loud confidence. Not the kind that demands attention. The quiet kind that comes from solving your own problems. During my second year of college, I attended a career presentation hosted by several federal agencies. Most students attended because free food was being offered. I attended because I was genuinely curious. Representatives from multiple organizations spoke about public service, leadership, and national security. Then, an FBI special agent stepped onto the stage. I still remember the way he spoke. There was no arrogance, no dramatic movie-style stories. Just a calm explanation of what it meant to serve something larger than yourself. For nearly an hour, I listened without looking away. When the presentation ended, something inside me felt different. It wasn't excitement exactly. It felt more like recognition. For the first time in my life, I could see a future that matched the values Grandpa had spent years teaching me. Discipline, integrity, service, purpose. That night I sat in my apartment staring at the FBI recruitment brochure. The practical part of me immediately listed reasons it was unrealistic. The selection process was competitive. The training was difficult. The standards were high. Nobody from my family had ever pursued a career like that. Then I remembered something Grandpa used to say whenever I doubted myself. Don't decide you're defeated before life gets the chance to try. The next morning, I began researching everything I could find. The years that followed were filled with preparation. Every decision became intentional. Every opportunity mattered. I maintained top grades. I pursued internships. I developed leadership experience. I learned how to perform under pressure. The more I learned about federal service, the more certain I became. This wasn't simply a career choice. It was a calling. My father didn't understand. During a visit home one summer, I mentioned my long-term goal over dinner. The reaction was exactly what I expected. He looked surprised for a moment before offering a polite smile. That's ambitious. The word sounded harmless, but I knew what it meant. Ambitious was the word people used when they didn't believe something would happen. Ethan laughed and asked whether FBI agents spent their entire day chasing criminals like in television shows. The conversation drifted elsewhere within minutes. Nobody asked another question. Years earlier, that would have devastated me. Instead, I found myself thinking about Grandpa's note, never let someone else's opinion become your identity. After graduation, I accepted a position that allowed me to continue building the experience required for federal service. The process took longer than I wanted. There were applications, interviews, background checks, additional training, more waiting than I thought possible. Several times I considered giving up. Several times I wondered whether my father had been right all along. Maybe it was too ambitious. Maybe people like me didn't end up in organizations like the FBI. Whenever those thoughts appeared, I opened Grandpa's note and read it again. Then one rainy Tuesday afternoon, nearly 7 years after his death, my phone rang. I answered without looking at the number. The voice on the other end introduced itself as an FBI recruiter. Within seconds, my entire future changed. The phone call lasted less than 10 minutes, but I remembered every second of it for years afterward. The recruiter explained the next phase of the process, outlined several requirements, and scheduled additional evaluations. By the time the conversation ended, I was standing in the middle of my apartment, staring out the window while rain slid down the glass. For a few moments, I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I couldn't even smile. The opportunity I had spent years chasing suddenly felt real. Then reality arrived with it. This wasn't the finish line. It was the beginning. The FBI wasn't offering me a badge. They were offering me a chance to prove I deserved one. The following months became some of the most demanding of my life. Every stage of the process seemed designed to test a different part of who I was. There were interviews that lasted hours, background investigations that examined nearly every chapter of my life, physical assessments, written evaluations, and long periods of waiting that felt harder than any test. Waiting leaves too much room for doubt. Some mornings I woke, convinced everything would work out. Other mornings I was certain I had already failed. Whenever those fears appeared, I found myself reaching for the silver pocket watch Grandpa had given me. I rarely opened it. Just holding it seemed enough. It reminded me that the people who mattered most had believed in me long before I had evidence to believe in myself. When the official acceptance finally arrived, I read the email 3 times because part of me thought I had misunderstood it. Then I called my mother. She cried before I finished the first sentence. It was the happiest I had heard her sound in years. My father's reaction was different. When I called him later that evening, there was a brief silence after I shared the news. "Well," he finally said, "that's impressive." The words should have meant more than they did. Years earlier, I would have replayed them for weeks. Instead, I found myself strangely detached, not because I didn't care, but because I was finally beginning to understand something important. My father's approval could never become the foundation of my confidence. It arrived too inconsistently. If I built my self-worth on it, I would spend my entire life waiting. Training challenged me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Most people assume federal service is primarily about intelligence or physical ability. Both matter, but what surprised me most was the psychological pressure. Every day demanded focus. Every mistake carried consequences. Every weakness eventually surfaced. There were moments when exhaustion made me question everything. There were days when failure seemed closer than success. Yet something unexpected happened. The same childhood experiences that had once felt unfair began helping me survive. Years of learning to work without recognition had created discipline. Years of feeling overlooked had taught me resilience. Years of handling disappointment had strengthened my ability to keep moving when things became difficult. The traits I once viewed as scars slowly revealed themselves as advantages. After completing training, I received my first assignment. Compared to the dramatic stories people associate with the FBI, the work seemed surprisingly ordinary at first. There were reports, investigations, interviews, and endless details. Real life rarely resembles movies. Most important victories are built from patience rather than excitement. I learned quickly that successful agents weren't the loudest people in the room. They were the most prepared. They paid attention. They noticed things others missed. In many ways, the job rewarded the exact skills I had developed growing up. Listening, observing, working quietly, remaining focused even when nobody was watching. Several years passed. Assignments came and went. Some investigations succeeded. Others produced frustration and dead ends. I made mistakes. I learned from them. Slowly, experience replaced uncertainty. The young woman who had once questioned every decision began trusting her instincts. Supervisors started giving me more responsibility. Opportunities increased. Promotions followed. None of it happened overnight. Real growth rarely does. Meanwhile, life back home continued moving in a very different direction. Ethan's athletic future never unfolded the way everyone expected. A series of injuries ended several opportunities before they truly began. He bounced between jobs, chasing one idea after another, always convinced success was just around the corner. My father continued supporting him financially and emotionally whenever things fell apart. Sometimes I wondered whether he would ever stop trying to rescue Ethan from consequences. Then I reminded myself that comparison solved nothing. My path was different. It always had been. One Christmas, several years into my career, I returned home for the holidays. During dinner, relatives asked questions about my work. Most of them were respectful but vague because they didn't fully understand what I did. For the first time, I noticed something unusual. My father was listening, not pretending to listen, actually listening. Whenever someone asked a question, he waited for my answer. He even repeated one of my accomplishments later in the evening while speaking with a family friend. The moment was small. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. I did. The little girl inside me noticed immediately. Yet the feeling surprised me. Instead of excitement, I felt sadness. Not because he was paying attention now, because I realized how much I had wanted it 20 years earlier. The following year brought the most significant investigation of my career. The case involved multiple agencies and stretched across several states. For months, our team worked long hours gathering information, coordinating resources, and following leads that seemed to multiply faster than we could process them. There were nights when I barely slept. Weeks disappeared into a blur of travel, meetings, and reports. At times, the pressure felt overwhelming. Yet I loved the work, not because it was exciting, but because it mattered. Every decision carried real consequences. Every success protected people. Every step forward represented something larger than personal achievement. Near the end of the investigation, one of my supervisors called me into his office. I assumed there was another assignment waiting. Instead, he closed the door and asked me to sit down. For several seconds, he reviewed a file before speaking. "You've built a strong reputation," he said. "The statement caught me off guard. Praise from experienced leaders always did," he continued. "People trust you. They rely on you. They respect your judgment." I wasn't sure how to respond. Eventually, I simply thanked him. Then he said something that stayed with me long afterward. "The best leaders aren't the people trying hardest to be noticed. They're the people making everyone around them better." The words reminded me of Grandpa immediately. As my career advanced, recognition began arriving from unexpected places. Commendations, leadership opportunities, special assignments. Every accomplishment felt meaningful, but none of them produced the emotional reaction I once imagined. Growing up, I believed success would eventually heal old wounds. Reality was more complicated. Success created confidence, it created freedom, it created purpose. But it couldn't change the past. The little girl standing in the kitchen holding that spelling certificate still existed somewhere inside me. She simply no longer controlled my decisions. Then one afternoon, nearly 20 years after my grandfather's death, a large envelope arrived at my office. At first, I assumed it contained routine paperwork. I almost set it aside for later. Something made me open it immediately. Inside was an official letter from Washington, D.C. I read the first paragraph once, then twice, then a third time. My pulse quickened with every line. The letter informed me that I had been selected for a prestigious national leadership recognition honoring exceptional service, mentorship, and professional achievement. The ceremony would take place at FBI headquarters in Washington. For several minutes, I simply stared at the page. Then my eyes drifted toward the silver pocket watch resting inside my desk drawer. And for the first time in many years, I found myself wishing more than anything that Grandpa could see what was happening. Because somewhere deep inside, I knew this invitation was about to change far more than my career. It was about to force my father to see something he had spent decades overlooking. The invitation sat on my desk for nearly an hour before I finally picked it up again. During that time, I must have read every line at least 10 times. The words never changed, but somehow they felt more real each time I looked at them. For most of my life, success had always existed somewhere in the distance. It was something I worked toward without really thinking about what it would feel like if I actually arrived. There was always another assignment, another challenge, another responsibility waiting around the corner. The recognition itself wasn't what stunned me. What stunned me was the realization that people had been paying attention when I wasn't trying to be noticed. The letter informed me that I had been selected for a national leadership recognition ceremony at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., honoring exceptional service, mentorship, and professional achievement. Reading those words felt strange because when I looked back on my career, I didn't see anything extraordinary. I saw long hours, I saw missed holidays. I saw difficult investigations and countless ordinary days spent doing my job. I saw mistakes, lessons, sacrifices, and responsibilities. I didn't see an award. Yet somehow, years of showing up consistently had become something bigger than I realized. The first person I wanted to tell was the one person I couldn't call. For a moment, my eyes drifted toward the silver pocket watch resting inside the top drawer of my desk. Nearly 20 years had passed since Grandpa Thomas handed it to me across his kitchen table. The metal was more worn now. The scratches seemed deeper. But every time I held it, I could still hear his voice. Never let someone else's opinion become your identity. I smiled to myself and shook my head. If he had been alive, he would have acted surprised while secretly enjoying every second of it. He would have pretended the ceremony wasn't a big deal before immediately asking 100 questions. The thought made me laugh softly. The first actual phone call went to my mother. The moment I explained why I was calling, she became quiet. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I heard her crying softly on the other end of the line. "Mom?" I asked. She laughed through the tears. "I'm okay." Another pause followed. "I just wish Dad could have heard Grandpa say, 'I told you so.'" That made me laugh. It sounded exactly like something Grandpa would have done. Then her voice softened. "He would be so proud of you, Rachel." The words settled heavily in my chest. Even after all those years, hearing someone mention Grandpa carried a weight that never fully disappeared. We talked for nearly an hour, not about the ceremony itself, about the journey, about all the years between that small Montana town and the office where I now sat. By the time we ended the call, I felt calmer than I had all day. Calling my father felt different. Not difficult exactly, just complicated. For most of my life, conversations about my achievements had always felt slightly awkward. There was too much history standing between us. Too many years when neither of us quite knew how to communicate. When he answered, we exchanged the usual small talk before I finally mentioned the invitation. The silence that followed was almost comical. "Dad?" I finally asked. "I'm here." Another pause. "Washington?" he asked. "Yes." "FBI headquarters?" "Yes." I could practically hear him processing the information. "And you're receiving an award?" I smiled. "Something like that." The next 20 minutes surprised me. He asked questions. Real questions. Not polite questions. Interested questions. Questions about my work, my responsibilities, my career path, and the recognition itself. For the first time in my life, I felt as though he genuinely wanted to understand what I had spent years building. The experience was both satisfying and strangely sad. Part of me couldn't help wondering what my life would have looked like if those conversations had happened 20 years earlier. A few days later, another packet arrived containing additional details about the event. Guest information, travel arrangements, security procedures, seating assignments. As I read through the material, one section caught my attention. Honorees were permitted to invite immediate family members. I stared at the page for several seconds. The decision should have been easy. Instead, I found myself thinking about every complicated chapter of my relationship with my father. For years, I had imagined a moment when he would finally understand who I was. I used to believe that moment would feel like victory. Now I wasn't so sure. Eventually, I picked up the phone. When he answered, I simply asked, "Would you like to come with me?" His response came immediately. "Absolutely." The excitement in his voice sounded genuine, unexpectedly genuine. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. Maybe people really could change. The weeks leading up to the ceremony passed quickly. Work remained demanding, which helped keep my mind occupied. Every few days another email arrived regarding the event. The closer it came, the more attention it seemed to receive within the agency. Supervisors congratulated me. Colleagues stopped by my office. Several people whose opinions I respected deeply took the time to offer encouragement. Each conversation reminded me how fortunate I had been throughout my career. Along the way, I had worked beside leaders who valued competence over attention and integrity over ego. Looking back, I realized many of them had quietly shaped me in the same way Grandpa once had. 2 weeks before the ceremony, I traveled home to Montana for a short visit. The familiar roads felt smaller than I remembered. The houses seemed closer together. Even the mountains looked different somehow. Funny how places change once you've spent enough years away from them. My father met me at the front door. Age had softened him. His hair was almost completely gray now. The confidence that once seemed immovable had become quieter, more reflective. We spent most of the evening talking at the kitchen table, the same kitchen where I had once stood holding a spelling certificate, the same kitchen where so many small disappointments had accumulated over the years. Yet the atmosphere felt entirely different now. My father listened carefully as I described parts of my work. Occasionally, he asked thoughtful questions. Occasionally, he simply nodded. At one point, he looked at me for a long moment and said, "I don't think I ever realized how much responsibility you've carried." The statement wasn't dramatic, it wasn't an apology, but it was honest. And honesty mattered. The following morning, I drove to the cemetery alone. The sky was clear and bright. A light breeze moved through the trees surrounding the hillside. Grandpa's grave sat exactly where I remembered. Simple, quiet, unassuming, somehow perfectly fitting. I stood there for a long time holding the silver pocket watch in my hand. The years seemed to collapse inward. Suddenly I was 17 again, sitting on a porch, listening to advice I didn't fully understand, wondering whether anyone would ever see me clearly. "You were right," I said quietly. The words felt small against the open Montana sky, yet they felt necessary. For years, I thought success meant earning recognition. Standing there, I realized success meant something else entirely. It meant becoming the person he always believed I could be. That evening, my father and I sat on the back porch watching the sunset. The mountains glowed orange beneath the fading light. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he surprised me. I spent a lot of years looking in the wrong direction. I turned toward him. He stared out at the horizon. I kept waiting for Ethan to become the person I imagined. His voice carried no bitterness, only reflection. While I was doing that, I missed a lot. The statement hung in the air between us. Years earlier, I would have responded differently. I might have wanted explanations. I might have wanted accountability. Instead, I simply listened. Sometimes understanding matters more than arguments. My father sighed softly. I wasn't paying attention. The honesty in those 4 words hit harder than any apology could have. For the first time, I believed he truly saw the past the way it happened. 3 days later, we boarded a plane bound for Washington. As the aircraft climbed above the clouds, my father looked out the window like a man heading toward something important. The irony wasn't lost on me. For most of my childhood, I had spent years hoping he would notice me. Now we were flying across the country to attend an event where he would be forced to see me through the eyes of people who already knew my worth. Neither of us knew exactly what would happen when we arrived. But somewhere deep inside, I felt certain of one thing. The journey that had started in a small Montana town was about to come full circle. The morning of the ceremony began long before sunrise. I woke up before my alarm and spent several minutes staring at the ceiling of my hotel room, listening to the distant sounds of Washington waking up outside. For years, I had imagined what success would feel like. When I was younger, I thought it would feel like validation. I thought it would feel like finally winning a competition I had been losing my entire life. I thought it would erase old disappointments and somehow make everything that happened in the past hurt less. But lying there in the darkness, I realized none of those things were true. What I felt most was gratitude. Gratitude for every challenge that had shaped me. Gratitude for every setback that forced me to become stronger. Gratitude for every moment when life demanded more from me than I thought I could give. Most of all, I felt grateful for one old man sitting on a porch in Montana years ago, quietly telling a little girl not to let someone else's opinion become her identity. I dressed carefully and slipped Grandpa's silver pocket watch into the inside pocket of my jacket. I had carried it through college, through training, through difficult assignments, through promotions, through moments of doubt and moments of triumph. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't valuable in the way people usually define value. But to me, it represented something bigger than any award I would ever receive. It represented belief. The kind of belief that changes a person's life. Before leaving the room, I held it for a moment and smiled. "This one's for you," I whispered. When I reached the lobby, my father was already waiting. He stood near the entrance, adjusting his tie for what looked like the 10th time. Seeing him nervous almost made me laugh. Throughout my childhood, he had always seemed so certain about everything. He always had answers, always had opinions, always seemed confident about the future. Yet standing there that morning, he looked like a man carrying the weight of something he couldn't quite explain. As we rode toward FBI headquarters, neither of us spoke very much. The city moved past the windows while my mind drifted backward through time. I thought about the little girl standing in the kitchen holding a spelling certificate nobody cared about. I thought about the teenager sitting alone after another family celebration centered around Ethan. I thought about the nights I spent studying while wondering whether hard work would ever matter. Looking back now, I realized every one of those moments had built something inside me. At the time, they felt like rejection. In reality, they were building resilience. The moment we entered FBI headquarters, my father became noticeably quieter. The building carried a sense of history and purpose that was difficult to describe. People moved through the hallways with confidence and urgency. Conversations happened in low voices. Security personnel stood at every major entrance. Agency leaders greeted one another. It was a world built on responsibility. A world I had spent years becoming part of. We joined the line for registration and slowly moved forward. My father looked around constantly, taking everything in. I remember wondering what he was thinking. Was he proud, nervous, overwhelmed? Maybe all three. When we finally reached the registration desk, I handed over my credentials. The woman behind the counter scanned them and immediately looked up. Her expression changed. Then she turned toward the far side of the lobby and called out, "Sir, she's here." Several nearby conversations stopped. Heads turned. Across the room, Deputy Director Mason Reed immediately began walking toward us. The look on my father's face was something I will never forget. Confusion appeared first, then surprise, then disbelief. He watched one of the highest-ranking leaders in the entire agency walk directly toward his daughter. The Deputy Director smiled warmly as he reached us. "Special Agent Rachel Bennett," he said. I nodded. "Sir." He extended his hand. "We've been waiting for you." Those 5 words seemed to freeze time. "We've been waiting for you. Not for my father, not for a politician, not for some important guest. For me?" Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father's expression change completely. More leaders joined us. One after another, they greeted me by name. They spoke about investigations I had worked on, leadership programs I had helped build, mentoring initiatives I had participated in, and contributions I never imagined anyone beyond my immediate professional circles even remembered. My father stood silently listening to strangers describe a version of me he had never truly known. For years he had assumed he understood who I was. Within a few minutes, he realized how much of my life had unfolded beyond his view. The ceremony itself took place in a large auditorium filled with federal officials, families, agency personnel, and invited guests. Flags lined the stage. Large screens displayed photographs and biographies of the honorees. My assigned seat was near the front. As we walked toward it, my father stopped and looked at the name card. Then he looked at me. "Rachel," he said quietly. I turned toward him. "Yes?" He hesitated. "I didn't realize." The sentence remained unfinished because it didn't need to be. I simply smiled and took my seat. The presentations began. Stories of service and leadership filled the room. One by one, names were announced and achievements recognized. Then my photograph appeared on the screen. Seeing my own face displayed above hundreds of people felt surreal. The presenter began reading a summary of my career: years of service, multi-state investigations, leadership initiatives, community outreach programs, mentorship efforts, professional achievements. Listening to the words felt strange because none of those accomplishments had ever felt extraordinary while they were happening. They were simply the result of showing up every day and doing the work. When my name was finally called, I stood and walked toward the stage. The audience applauded politely at first. Then the applause grew stronger. Halfway there, I glanced toward the crowd and saw my father standing. His eyes were wet. For years, I imagined what it would feel like if he were ever proud of me. The reality wasn't satisfying or triumphant. It was heartbreaking. Because I suddenly realized how much time we had lost. How many moments we would never get back. How many achievements he had never witnessed. How many conversations we never had. The ceremony continued after my presentation, but emotionally I was somewhere else. I kept thinking about Grandpa. I kept imagining him sitting somewhere in the audience smiling quietly. He had seen this day long before anyone else. Not the award itself. Not the ceremony. The person I would eventually become. He saw potential when it existed only as possibility. He saw strength before I knew I possessed it. He believed before there was evidence. When the event finally ended, guests slowly filtered out of the auditorium. My father and I found ourselves walking through a quieter section of the building lined with photographs from the FBI's history. After several minutes, he stopped. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked at me. Really looked at me. Not as Ethan's sister. Not as his daughter. As me. "I'm sorry," he said. The words came out quietly. I spent years looking in the wrong direction. I remained silent. He swallowed hard. I kept waiting for Ethan to become the person I imagined he would be. His voice cracked slightly. And while I was doing that, I completely missed who you already were. Hearing those words didn't erase the past. Nothing could. But for the first time, I felt like we were standing on the same side of it. I thought about Grandpa again. I thought about forgiveness. I thought about all the years I spent wishing this moment would happen. Then I smiled. "We still have time, Dad." Tears filled his eyes. He nodded. Neither of us said anything else for a while. The following morning, before leaving Washington, I sat alone on a bench overlooking part of the city. The silver pocket watch rested in my hand. Cars moved through the streets. People hurried to work. Life continued exactly as it always had, and suddenly, everything made sense. Success was never about proving someone wrong. It was never about making people regret underestimating me. It was never about standing on a stage while strangers applauded. Success was becoming the person I wanted to be, without allowing disappointment to make me bitter. Success was carrying my grandfather's lessons into every chapter of my life. Success was learning that my value had never depended on who noticed it. If you're listening to this story today, and you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or invisible, I want you to remember something. The people around you do not get to decide your worth. Their attention doesn't define you. Their approval doesn't define you. Their doubts certainly don't define you. Keep building, keep learning, keep growing, keep moving forward even when nobody seems to notice. Because one day you'll look back and realize that every difficult chapter was preparing you for something bigger than you could see at the time. And if this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who may need the same reminder today. Leave a comment about the person who believed in you when nobody else did. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, second chances, family healing, and ordinary people overcoming extraordinary odds, don't forget to follow the channel, subscribe, and join our community. Your support allows these stories to reach people who need them most. Until next time, remember this: being overlooked does not make you ordinary. Sometimes the people who see your value first are the ones who change your life forever. For me, that person was my grandfather. And everything good that followed began with one simple gift: belief.